Yesterday, India's Ministry of External Affairs issued a short, almost bureaucratic statement. A spokesperson rejected a Pakistani minister's warning about war, calling it a distraction from Pakistan's own failures, and repeated a position India has now held for more than a year. The Indus Waters Treaty, the spokesperson said, remains suspended and will stay that way until Pakistan permanently ends what India calls cross-border terrorism. If you don't follow South Asian politics closely, that sentence probably slid right past you. It shouldn't have, because what that statement quietly confirms is one of the most significant ruptures in international law in the last half-century, and almost nobody outside the region is talking about it. The Indus Waters Treaty is not some minor diplomatic paperwork. For 65 years, it governed how India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed neighbors with a long history of open warfare, shared one of the largest river systems on the planet. It survived a war in 1965. It survived a war in 1971. It survived the Kargil conflict in 1999, fought at altitude with both countries already holding nuclear weapons. Through all of it, the water kept flowing on schedule, governed by an agreement that both sides, however reluctantly, kept honoring. As of last year, for the first time in the treaty's entire history, that stopped. And here's what makes this story worth 20 minutes of your time. This isn't a story about missiles or airstrikes, even though both of those have happened in this same conflict. It's a story about something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. The tool being used to pressure 240 million people doesn't look like a weapon at all. It looks like routine dam maintenance, and that distinction between what a thing is called and what a thing actually does turns out to be the whole story. To understand why this treaty mattered so much in the first place, you have to go back to where it came from, because the origin story here is almost the opposite of how most international conflicts get resolved. In 1947, when British colonial rule over India ended, the subcontinent was partitioned into two new countries. The border cut straight through the Indus River system, a network of 6 major rivers that had irrigated this land for thousands of years. The problem was almost comically cruel in its geography. The headworks, the infrastructure that controlled the flow of water into the irrigation canals, ended up on India's side of the new border. The farmland that depended on those canals ended up in Pakistan. For a moment in 1948, India actually shut off the canal flow entirely, and Pakistan got a preview of exactly how vulnerable its new agricultural economy really was. What happened next is a genuinely unusual piece of Cold War diplomacy. An American engineer named David Lilienthal, who had previously run the Tennessee Valley Authority and the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, visited the region in the early 1950s to write magazine articles and came away convinced that India and Pakistan needed a jointly managed water agreement, brokered by an outside party neither government could dominate. He brought the idea to Eugene Black, then president of the World Bank, who spent most of the next decade personally shepherding negotiations between two governments that, by then, had already fought one war over Kashmir and barely spoke to each other on anything else. In 1960, after 9 years of talks, India's Prime Minister and Pakistan's President signed the treaty in Karachi, with the World Bank as a formal co-signatory and guarantor. The deal split the river system geographically. India got largely unrestricted use of the 3 eastern rivers. Pakistan got the 3 western rivers, including the Indus itself and its largest tributary, the Chenab, which together carry roughly 80% of the entire system's water. India retained limited rights on those western rivers too, mainly for irrigation and what's called run-of-the-river hydropower, generating electricity from a river's natural flow without significantly storing or diverting the water itself. President Eisenhower, watching from Washington, called the agreement one bright spot in what he described as an otherwise depressing world picture. For once, that kind of praise turned out to be earned. The treaty worked and kept working for 65 years. So why did it break now? And why over an attack that, on paper, had nothing to do with water at all? On April 22, 2025, gunmen opened fire on tourists in a meadow near Pahalgam, in Indian-administered Kashmir, killing 26 civilians, most of them Hindu visitors from elsewhere in India. India attributed the attack to a group with links to a Pakistan-based militant organization. Pakistan denied any involvement. The next day, India announced it would hold the Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance, a legal term that doesn't actually appear anywhere in the treaty's own text. The treaty describes procedures for amendment, for arbitration, for dispute resolution. It contains no provision at all for one side to simply suspend it unilaterally. India did it anyway, alongside a set of other punitive measures, including closing the main land border crossing and, in the weeks that followed, launching a military operation inside Pakistani territory. Pakistan responded with strikes of its own. The two countries came closer to open, sustained warfare than they had in decades, before a ceasefire brought the immediate fighting to a halt. The ceasefire held, the treaty did not come back. And this is where the story shifts from a diplomatic dispute into something genuinely novel, because what India has done with its access to the western rivers since that suspension isn't a simple, blunt cutoff. It's something more calibrated and considerably harder to challenge in any court, because it hides inside a process that looks completely legitimate on paper. Reservoirs behind hydroelectric dams accumulate silt over time. If you don't periodically clear that silt out, the reservoir loses storage capacity and the dam's turbines can suffer damage. The standard technique for doing this is called flushing, releasing a controlled surge of water to carry accumulated sediment out of the reservoir before refilling it. It's a real engineering necessity. Every major dam operator does it. It is also, as it turns out, an extremely effective way to control exactly when water reaches a downstream farmer without ever officially declaring that you're withholding anything at all. In the days after the treaty was suspended, India began flushing operations at the Baglihar and Salal dams on the Chenab River, the two hydroelectric projects that have generated the most friction with Pakistan since they were built. Indian officials described this to journalists as a short-term punitive action layered on top of routine maintenance, with water flow to Pakistan reduced for roughly 1 to 2 weeks while the process ran its course. The specific timing mattered enormously because it landed close to the start of Pakistan's Kharif sowing season, the period when farmers plant the crops that depend on predictable water arriving through the Chenab Canal system. By December of that year, the effects were visible from space. Satellite imagery showed the surface area of the Baglihar Reservoir had shrunk dramatically, a clear sign of upstream water retention. And downstream at Pakistan's Marala headworks in Punjab, measured flow had fallen to somewhere around 870 cusecs, against a 10-year seasonal norm in the range of 4,000 to 4,400. That's not a modest reduction. That's a river running at a small fraction of what an entire agricultural region had been built around for generations. Here is the mechanism worth holding on to, because it's the real insight buried inside this story. India never needed to permanently stop the Indus, the Chenab, or the Jhelum from reaching Pakistan at all, and by most measures, it hasn't. What it has demonstrated is that it doesn't need to. Controlling the timing of releases from a small number of strategically placed dams is enough to devastate a planting season, or run the other direction, to release water suddenly during a vulnerable window and cause flooding instead. A South Asia advisor at the consulting firm Teneo put this plainly earlier this summer, noting that Pakistan had already written to India multiple times about abrupt, unexplained flow variations on the Chenab, and that the diplomatic window to resolve this through dialogue keeps narrowing. The weapon here was never really the water. It's the calendar. Pakistan, understandably, has tried to fight this through the treaty's own legal machinery. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which has jurisdiction over certain categories of Indus Waters disputes, issued a ruling in May of 2026 concerning what's called pondage, the maximum volume a reservoir is permitted to hold at any given time. The court's language was notably direct, stating that compliance under the treaty is determined by the actual substantive effect on downstream flows, not by whatever label a government chooses to attach to a given operation. In plain terms, the court said it doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is what happens to the water. India rejected the ruling outright, describing the court itself as illegitimately constituted, and has continued to decline requests to share detailed operational data on dam inflows and outflows. Whichever side of this dispute you find more persuasive, one fact is not in question. There is currently no functioning legal mechanism actually compelling either government to do anything differently. And this is the part of the story that deserves real caution, because the human cost being reported varies enormously depending on the source, and some of the more dramatic figures circulating, specific percentages for crop losses, specific counts of flooded farmland, come from outlets without the kind of verification that official statistics or peer-reviewed research would carry. What's well documented from sources including the CSIS think tank in Washington is the underlying structural exposure. Roughly 90% of Pakistan's available fresh water goes toward agriculture. That sector alone accounts for close to a quarter of the country's entire economic output and directly employs a large share of its workforce. All 21 of Pakistan's hydroelectric power stations sit inside the Indus Basin. This is a country, as one analyst put it, whose water dependency isn't a marginal vulnerability sitting off to the side of its economy. It's a load-bearing pillar underneath an economy that was already navigating an International Monetary Fund bailout program before any of this began. That's the backdrop against which Pakistan's defense minister said on the record that if his country's leadership concludes its national security is genuinely threatened, and he was explicit that water counts as part of national security, Pakistan will go to war over it. He added, in the same breath, that current current conditions haven't reached that threshold yet. Read those two statements together and you get a fairly precise picture of where things actually stand. Not at war, not at peace, sitting in the narrow, uncomfortable space in between, where one side controls a resource the other side cannot survive without, and where the tool being used to apply that pressure is deliberately built to be difficult to prove and easy to deny. I want to pull the lens back for a moment, because as unusual as this situation is, it isn't actually unique. It's an early, clear example of a pattern quietly showing up in river systems around the world, wherever an upstream and downstream countries share water, but not trust. In East Africa, Ethiopia completed the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile in 2025 without ever reaching a binding agreement with Egypt or Sudan downstream on how the reservoir would be managed during drought years. Egypt depends on the Nile for the overwhelming majority of its fresh water and has called the dam an existential threat, while Ethiopia argues it has every right to develop a river that originates almost entirely within its own borders. Multiple rounds of mediation, involving the African Union, the United States, and others, have failed to produce anything both sides will actually sign. Farther east, China controls the headwaters of the Brahmaputra River before it flows into India, and has been constructing what will become the largest hydropower facility on Earth on that same river, again with no binding treaty governing operations with the countries downstream. Different rivers, different governments, different histories. The same underlying structural fact keeps repeating. Whoever sits upstream, holding the infrastructure, holds a form of leverage that doesn't require a single soldier to cross a border. Which brings us to the framework I think this story actually teaches, one that reaches well beyond South Asia or any specific river. When people imagine a resource being weaponized, the instinct is usually to picture an outright blockade, a valve turned fully shut, a supply cut off completely and visibly. That's rarely how it actually works in practice, because a total cutoff is the one move that's impossible to deny and easiest for the rest of the world to condemn. The far more effective and far more common tool is what I'd call the deniable choke point, a piece of infrastructure that has a genuine, legitimate technical purpose and can be operated in a way that produces coercive pressure without ever crossing the line into something a court or the international community can cleanly label an attack. A dam needs periodic flushing regardless of politics. A reservoir needs sediment management regardless of who lives downstream. That legitimate function becomes the cover under which timing itself gets turned into leverage. It's a form of pressure engineered specifically to survive scrutiny, because on paper, nothing illegal or even unusual is happening at all. Once you understand this mechanism, you start to notice how much broader it applies than water alone. Any system where one party controls the timing of a shared essential flow, whether that's water, energy, data, or components inside a supply chain, carries this same latent structure. The infrastructure itself is neutral. The decision about when to operate it is where the actual power sits, and that decision is very hard for outsiders to audit, precisely because it's buried inside routine technical operations rather than announced as policy. So where does this actually go from here? I don't think there's a clean, satisfying answer available yet, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise. What we can say with real confidence is that the legal architecture meant to prevent exactly this kind of situation, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the treaty's own dispute mechanisms, the World Bank's role as guarantor, has been tested and has not held. The World Bank itself has said its role is limited to that of a facilitator, and it has not intervened. Pakistan's structural dependency on this water isn't shrinking, and neither is the diplomatic distance between the two governments. Every additional month this continues without a resolution deepens the economic strain on one side and normalizes, a little further, the idea that suspending a 65-year treaty is simply a tool a government can reach for during a crisis, rather than a red line that holds regardless of the circumstances. The question worth sitting with isn't really whether India and Pakistan eventually find their way back to some version of this agreement, though they might. It's what happens to every other shared river system on the planet once the world has watched one of the most durable water treaties in modern history get suspended over an attack that had nothing directly to do with water at all, and seen that suspension survive with no binding consequence for well over a year. Precedents in international relations rarely announce themselves as precedents at the moment they're set. They just quietly become the new baseline that the next government, watching from somewhere else entirely, uses to calculate what it can get away with next.